The storm ripped across the city like an uninvited guest. Thunder rattled windows, rain flooded the marble steps of the Whitfield estate, and staff scrambled with umbrellas to protect polished shoes and designer gowns. Then, in the middle of that chaos, the impossible happened. Malik. A single word, trembling yet clear, slipped past lips that had never parted for sound. Amara Whitfield, the billionaire's daughter, silent since birth, spoke her first word. Not to her father, not to her mother, not to the doctors who had tried for decades. She spoke to the man standing outside the gates, drenched in rainwater, his neon vest plastered to his back, Malik, the garbage man. The world seemed to freeze. For 20 years, the Whitfields had built their lives around her silence, specialists flown in, money poured into tests, excuses whispered to high society. Now, in a single heartbeat, that silence shattered. The first climax, Amara's voice. The second, she had chosen him. Malik stood rooted, one hand still gripping a trash bin. His name echoed in his ears louder than the thunder. He had picked up the mansion's garbage for years without notice. To them, he was invisible. But to her, the untouchable heiress, he was the first person worth speaking to. Umbrellas clattered as staff gasped. A maid dropped her tray in shock. Someone crossed themselves. Every eye darted to Richard Whitfield, the patriarch, waiting for his reaction. And here came the reversal. Richard's face didn't soften. It hardened. Fury burned through his features as he barked, "Get her inside." Now. Servants rushed forward, dragging Amara away, but her gaze clung to Malik. Rain streaked her cheeks, mixing with what looked like tears. She reached out a trembling hand through the iron bars until she was pulled back inside. A billionaire's empire had been humiliated in one word. And it wasn't the silence that broke him, it was the choice of who she had spoken to. How many times have we ignored someone's voice because of who they were? If you've ever done it, subscribe now. Don't let silence be the only thing you leave behind. Hours earlier, no one would have believed this night was possible. Amara's life had been measured in unspoken moments, galas where glasses clinked and she sat frozen in sequin gowns, medical journals filled with theories about her condition, whispered gossip at charity balls. All that money, and she can't even say goodnight. She had been pitted like a broken doll, paraded like an ornament. But silence is not emptiness, it's pressure. It had weighed on her since birth, turning her into a statue in a golden cage. And yet, all it took was one man, standing soaked in rain with hands that reeked of garbage, to unlock what billions could not. Malik staggered back toward his truck, still trembling. He had worked this route for years, same gates, same bags, same indifference. He knew the city's waste better than anyone. But he had never carried something like this. A secret that would soon explode. As he heaved the bin into the truck, he felt curtains shift in the mansion windows. Eyes burned holes into his back. They weren't staring at the trash. They were staring at him, the man chosen by the voice that was never supposed to exist. For the first time in his life, Malik felt the weight of being seen. And it terrified him. Would you have laughed at him, or believed her? Subscribe now, because silence is never innocent, it's built by all of us. By dawn, the storm had passed, but the mansion hadn't recovered. A maid's cousin leaked the story online, she spoke. I swear I heard it. Hours later, a shaky video appeared, Amara's lips forming Malik's name as the rain poured down. It spread like wildfire. Doctors argued on TV. Reporters swarmed the gates. High society buzzed with scandal. Some said Malik tricked her. Others called it a miracle. But none could deny the truth. Amara Whitfield had spoken, and her first word was not for the empire of marble behind her, but for the man society had thrown to the curb. And the world would never see either of them the same way again. The morning after the storm, Malik's alarm buzzed at 3:45 a.m. as always. He rolled out of bed in his one-room apartment, the radiator clanking against the cold, and reached for the orange vest folded on the chair. Nothing about the room had changed: peeling paint, a mattress low to the floor, coffee gone stale in the tin. Yet he felt the air was heavier, as if the world outside already knew what had happened. By 4 o'clock, he was on his route. Normally, the streets were empty, silent except for the groan of the garbage truck. But not today. 2 teenagers stood on the corner, holding phones, whispering. Their screens glowed with the same shaky video, a girl's lips forming his name. Malik glanced once and saw himself faintly in the background, rain-drenched, startled, unprepared. His chest tightened. He loaded the first bin into the truck, but his hands trembled. He wasn't built for attention. His job had always been to clear what others threw away, to remain unseen. Yet now, his name was spoken more times in a single night than in years of labor. By sunrise, the story was everywhere. Radio hosts joked about the garbage man who did what billion-dollar doctors couldn't. Newspapers printed grainy screenshots. His co-workers at the depot stared, smirking and nudging each other. "Hey Malik," one called out, holding up his phone. "She said your name, man. You famous now." Malik forced a laugh, but inside he burned. Fame wasn't made for people like him. Fame ate you alive. Have you ever been thrown into a spotlight you didn't ask for? If yes, subscribe now, because you know how quickly it burns. At the Whitfield estate, silence had turned into lockdown. Reporters crowded the gates, microphones bristling like bayonets. Malik avoided that street, rerouting his truck, but he could still feel the pull. By midday, his supervisor called him into the office. "You need to be careful. Cameras are following the truck now. City Hall already called asking about you." Malik frowned. "For what? I didn't do anything." "That's the problem," his boss muttered. "They think you did." Back at his apartment that evening, Malik found a letter shoved under his door. No stamp, no name. Just a folded page: "Stay away from her. This isn't your story." He crushed the paper in his fist. His chest felt tight, his breath shallow. He hadn't asked for any of this. He hadn't gone looking for a billionaire's daughter or her silence. Yet now strangers wanted him gone. He lay awake that night, the hum of the radiator masking his restless thoughts. Why had she said his name? Why him? The next morning, he returned to his route. Children waved at him now, something they had never done. An old woman pressed a bag of warm bread into his hands, whispering, "Bless you, son." Even as kindness poured in, Malik felt it cut both ways. For every smile, there were eyes watching him with suspicion, muttering that he had manipulated her somehow. The weight of the city's judgment pressed down harder than the garbage bags he hauled each day. 3 nights later, Malik stood outside his apartment, taking out his own trash, when headlights flared. A black car pulled up. The window slid down. Inside sat a man in a tailored suit, his voice smooth but sharp. "Mr. Johnson, you need to disappear. The Whitfield family will pay you to leave the city." Malik stared. "I don't want their money." "Everyone wants money," the man said, tossing a card onto the pavement. "Think carefully. You're in over your head." The car sped off, leaving Malik with the card in his hand and bile rising in his throat. Would you take the money and run, or stand your ground? Subscribe now, because choices like this reveal who we really are. The following Sunday, Malik skipped his shift and walked through the city at dawn. The streets were quiet, the smell of rain still clinging to the pavement. He wandered without aim until he found himself near the river. There, alone, he let the memory replay. Her face through the iron bars, rain streaking down, lips shaping his name. He had carried trash his whole life, but now he was carrying her voice. And voices, once spoken, can't be thrown away. He leaned on the railing, eyes shut, the weight pressing harder. He thought of her, locked away, silenced not by her own body anymore, but by the people who feared what she might say next. For the first time, Malik realized he wasn't just part of the story. He was the story's only witness. And witnesses never walk away unchanged. The Whitfield mansion turned into a fortress. Security doubled at the gates, curtains drawn, reporters fenced behind barricades. Yet none of it could contain the story already spiraling through the city. Her voice, his name, had become both miracle and scandal. Malik tried to return to routine, but the streets themselves betrayed him. Graffiti bloomed on concrete walls, she spoke his name. Strangers pointed at his truck as it rattled past. His anonymity had been shredded. And still, every morning before dawn, he felt her eyes. Hidden behind the tall windows of the mansion, Amara watched. The world had made her silent, but now silence had become her weapon. She refused to answer her family's demands, refused the doctors, refused even her own reflection. She waited, eyes fixed beyond the glass, searching for the only person who had ever seen her without pity. 1 week after the storm, the mansion grounds stirred in unusual quiet. Malik, drawn by something he couldn't name, slowed his truck near the back gate. There she stood, no staff, no cameras, just Amara, pressed against the iron bars, her pale scarf trembling in the wind. Her eyes met his, wide and steady. The world seemed to contract to that gaze. She didn't move her lips this time, but the intent was clear. She had chosen him once, and she was choosing him again. Malik's hands gripped the handle of the truck tighter. He had never been meant to cross into marble halls, never meant to stand in the glow of chandeliers. Yet here she was, breaking her gilded cage with nothing more than presence. How many times have we ignored the ones reaching for us through the bars? If you've done it, subscribe now, because silence on your part could be someone else's prison. The days blurred into surveillance. Wherever Malik walked, lenses followed. His co-workers grew restless, muttering that his presence made them targets too. And yet, each time he passed the mansion, her silhouette appeared. A pale figure behind curtains, her hand resting on glass, eyes unblinking. The city framed it as spectacle, tabloids calling it the heiress's obsession. But to Malik, it was raw humanity. She wasn't obsessed, she was breaking chains, searching for air. At night, Malik lay awake on his narrow bed, remembering her hand outstretched in the storm. Now, that same hand lingered on glass, a silent plea. He carried it like a second heartbeat. On the 10th day, it happened again. The mansion's back garden, usually crawling with staff, was empty. Malik had just turned the corner with his truck when he saw her. This time she wasn't behind bars or curtains. She was in the open, barefoot on the lawn, her thin dress stirring in the wind. Every instinct told him to keep walking. To let the truck rumble on and leave her in her gilded world. But her gaze pinned him in place. She raised her hand, not trembling, not desperate, but certain. And then, without sound, she mouthed the word again, Malik. He felt it like thunder, even in silence. His throat tightened. The cameras would find him here. Her family would crush him for this. Yet turning away felt like betrayal, not just of her, but of himself. For years, he had been invisible. Now, for the first time, someone saw him fully. Would you walk away from the one person who saw you, even if it destroyed you? Subscribe now, because that choice defines you more than any fortune ever could. The sound of footsteps broke the moment. Guards appeared at the far end of the lawn, voices sharp, radios crackling. Amara's head snapped toward them, then back to Malik. Her bare feet dug into the wet grass, refusing to move until hands seized her arms. Malik's chest heaved as he climbed back into his truck. He couldn't risk more, not now. But in his mirror, he saw her struggling against the guards, her eyes still fixed on him even as they dragged her away. The message was undeniable. She didn't want freedom in theory, she wanted it tethered to him. And that knowledge sat heavier than any bag of trash he had ever carried. That night, a new message appeared online. Not from staff, not from gossip blogs. It was a photo, blurry, taken through iron bars, of Amara on the lawn, reaching outward. In the corner, barely visible, Malik's figure stood in the rain. The caption read, "Who is she really calling for?" The city roared with speculation. The mansion issued silence. And Malik lay awake once more, knowing the storm had not ended that night, it had only begun. The morning broke gray, heavy clouds pressed low over the skyline as if the city itself was bracing for impact. Outside the Whitfield estate, streets had become a living wall, news vans shoulder to shoulder, satellite dishes angled like weapons, reporters rehearsing lines while makeup crews fought the damp. The rumors of Amara's second appearance had turned whispers into a tidal wave. By midday, a platform had been raised in Lincoln Square, a place chosen for symbolism, polished marble, fountains drained for winter, flags snapping in the wind. Officials claimed it was a community health initiative, but everyone knew the real spectacle was not the speeches. It was whether the heiress would remain silent, or speak again. Crowds swelled against barricades. School children pressed their faces to iron rails, office clerks streamed from nearby towers, tourists hoisted phones in shivering hands. The atmosphere was neither carnival nor protest, but something in between, the anticipation of watching a world tilt on its axis. When the Whitfield convoy arrived, the noise fractured into shouts and camera flashes. Black cars rolled into place, doors opening with mechanical grace. Richard Whitfield emerged first, dark overcoat sweeping the steps, expression carved from stone. Behind him, Amara appeared, no security detail close enough to shield her entirely, no curtain to hide behind. Her pale scarf fluttered in the wind as she mounted the stage, her father at her elbow, aides forming a careful half-circle. The speeches began the way they always do, promises, thank yous, policy lines polished until they gleamed. The crowd clapped on cue, the sound thin against the hunger of expectation. They hadn't come for civic pledges. They had come for her. Amara stood still, hands folded before her, eyes scanning the sea of strangers. Some stared at her as if she were an artifact, others with pity, others with resentment. The silence pressed against her like a weight rediscovered. She had worn it her entire life, she knew its texture, its temperature, the way it caged her ribs. But something had shifted since the storm. Now silence felt like a weapon aimed at her, not a shield she had chosen. She moved. Without warning, Amara stepped forward, brushing past her father's shoulder. A ripple went through the officials, aides froze mid-gesture. She reached the lectern and gripped its sides with pale fingers. For a moment she only stared at the microphones, their black foam mouths gaping like expectant creatures. The square held its breath. Even the traffic noise seemed to crawl backward into itself. Then she spoke. 2 syllables, each deliberate, each louder than the history of her silence. Do better. The sound rippled across the plaza, bounced off glass towers, carried through every microphone. Gasps erupted, a woman dropped her phone, a child clutched his mother's sleeve. Do better, she repeated, steadier now, her voice cutting through the cold air like a blade. It was not a plea. It was not gratitude. It was an indictment, aimed at everyone and no one at once, the family that caged her, the city that treated workers as invisible, the world that laughed at silence but feared sound. Her father moved forward, hand outstretched, but too late. The words had already fled into every camera, every live stream, every ear. How many times have we heard those words in our own lives, and ignored them? If you've ever looked away when someone demanded better, subscribe now. Because ignoring truth is how silence wins. Across the street, Malik watched from the curb, half hidden behind his truck. He hadn't planned to be there, but his route had dragged him into the storm once again. When he heard her voice carry across the square, his chest tightened as if the syllables had been carved with his own name. He had never asked to be part of this story, but now he could no longer stand outside it. Amara lifted her chin, gaze sweeping the crowd. She wasn't addressing her father, or the press, or the officials shifting nervously behind her. Her eyes locked beyond the barricades, toward the workers in neon vests pressed shoulder to shoulder, toward the mothers holding children on tired hips, toward the forgotten who understood the cost of being unheard. Her voice rose once more, thin but unshaken. See them. The crowd erupted. Some clapped, some jeered, some cried. Reporters scrambled to reframe narratives, officials fumbled for order. Richard Whitfield's jaw set like a trap, but even he knew control was gone. Security closed in, cameras surged forward, and chaos cracked the square open. But the words remained, hovering above the noise, impossible to drag back. Malik gripped the side of his truck, knuckles white. For years he had lifted what the city discarded. Now he was watching the one person who had ever seen him lift a weight no machine could crush, the silence of an empire. Would you have stood with her in that moment, or turned away? Subscribe now, because silence doesn't end unless someone decides to break it. That night, the clip looped on every platform. Amara at the microphone, her lips forming two simple phrases. Analysts dissected her tone, experts speculated on her meaning, talk shows spun the moment into spectacle. But for those who had been there, the workers at the barricades, the strangers on the street, the word struck deeper. They were not performance. They were truth. Inside the Whitfield penthouse, arguments boiled behind locked doors. Contracts were drafted, lawyers consulted, strategies rehearsed. The family treated her voice as crisis management. But for Amara, the choice had already been made. She had spoken, and she would not unspeak. For Malik, sleep came in fragments. He lay in his narrow bed, replaying the moment again and again. Her voice, carried on cold air, telling the world to do better. Telling him, too. He realized with clarity that frightened him, her words had bound him to her. He could not pretend to be invisible anymore. And as dawn painted the skyline with the faintest light, Malik knew the world had shifted. The city had heard her. But the real storm was only beginning. By dawn the next day, the city was carved in two. On one side, voices praised Amara for breaking chains, for naming the invisible. On the other, voices whispered that she had been manipulated, that a garbage man's shadow lingered too close to her miracle. Malik woke to both. His name crawled across television tickers, poured from car radios, echoed through stairwell gossip. Photographs of him hauling bins now floated online beside captions he hadn't written. He had been invisible all his life, until her voice dragged him into a light that burned. When he arrived at the depot, silence greeted him first, then stares. Men he had worked beside for years shifted uneasily, some with envy, some with fear. One muttered under his breath, "Hero, huh?" Another smirked, shaking his head. The supervisor called him into the office before he'd touched a single bin. A man in a gray suit sat waiting. Not city sanitation, not union, something else. His tie was silk, his pen engraved, his eyes scanning Malik the way a banker scans collateral. On the desk lay a folder thick with papers. "Mr. Johnson," the man began, "your association with Miss Whitfield is problematic." Malik's chest tightened. He hadn't asked for association. He had only done his job, lived his life. Yet now, strangers built a story around him like scaffolding, ready to climb. The man slid a paper forward. A non-disclosure agreement. A signature line. A price tag hidden in clauses. "If you care for your privacy, and your safety," the man said, "sign. Walk away. The Whitfield family will see you, compensated." Malik stared at the pen, heavy in the man's manicured hand. The room's air thinned. Outside, the clang of trucks and laughter of men reminded him where he belonged. His whole life had been built on labor unrecorded, voices ignored. To sign was to erase himself willingly, to make her voice meaningless. He pushed the folder back. "I'm not for sale." The man's smile thinned, then disappeared. He stood, gathered the papers, and left without another word. How many of us have been offered money to keep quiet, directly or indirectly? If you've ever swallowed truth for comfort, subscribe now. Because silence bought is silence that kills. Meanwhile, high above the city, the Whitfield penthouse seethed. Richard paced before floor-to-ceiling windows, phone pressed to his ear. Every call was damage control, board members threatening to resign, investors doubting, politicians demanding reassurance. His empire had been built on polished glass and silence. Now both had cracked. Amara sat apart, knees drawn up beneath her dress, eyes fixed on nothing. She had spoken, and in speaking, she had chosen. Her father's fury was background noise, her family's fear irrelevant. Yet one thought looped endlessly. Malik's reflection in the truck window, hand lifted in answer to hers. That image anchored her, even as the world spun. When the door opened, her aunt swept in, sharp heels biting marble. She carried tabloids in one hand, headlines screaming across glossy covers, Heiress speaks, garbage man link. The photographs were grainy, but his figure was clear enough. This man, her aunt hissed, will ruin everything. He must be erased from the narrative. Amara's hands curled into fists. They wanted her words without her will, her voice without its truth. But she knew what they feared most, it wasn't her voice. It was who she had chosen to give it to. Across the city, Malik's apartment door rattled. A note had been slipped under again. No threats this time. Just a single word scrawled in ink, stop. He sat at his table, radiator clanging behind him, staring at the paper. His phone buzzed with calls from numbers he didn't recognize. Journalists, bloggers, opportunists, all wanting a quote, a comment, a piece of him. He deleted messages until the screen blurred. The city, once deaf to him, now screamed his name. And yet, he had no one to answer but himself. Have you ever been silenced not by force, but by noise too loud to cut through? Subscribe now, because drowning truth is the quietest way to bury it. That night, Malik walked. Past bodegas closing for the evening, past subway entrances humming with tired commuters. He moved until the streets emptied and the skyline stretched like jagged teeth. He found himself at the edge of the river, the city lights trembling across dark water. He thought of her, her voice rising in the square, her hand lifting to glass. He thought of the word she chose, workers. Do better. See them. She hadn't spoken for her family. She hadn't spoken for donors. She had spoken for him, and for all the invisible lives he represented. And now the weight of that truth sat on his shoulders. Somewhere in the city, she was locked inside rooms of glass and marble, her every breath measured, her every move controlled. Somewhere in those rooms, she remembered him too. Malik knew it with a certainty that was both terrifying and tender. For the first time, he understood, he could not stay silent anymore. The world had hurt her. Now, whether he wanted it or not, it was time the world heard him too. Night draped itself across the city, but the Whitfield estate never truly slept. Floodlights washed the gardens in sterile glow, shadows trimmed into submission by manicured hedges. Cameras blinked red in the corners like unblinking eyes. Malik had not walked here. He had been delivered, summoned by a letter marked mandatory hearing, escorted by men in dark coats whose silence carried the weight of threat. His boots echoed on marble as they led him through corridors too polished to belong to real life. The smell was sharp, wax, perfume, and the faint tang of money old enough to rot. In the atrium, Amara waited. Not free, never free. Two guards lingered at a respectful distance, but their posture said chains. She sat on a low bench beneath a chandelier that dripped light like melted glass. Her hands were folded in her lap, the thin scar of a hospital bracelet still faint against her wrist. When she lifted her gaze and found him, the room shifted. Her silence was not emptiness, it was pressure, like air before a storm. Malik felt it settle into his chest, heavy and unavoidable. No words were exchanged, none were needed. The guards stepped back, and for the first time since the square, they were face to face without glass between them. Richard Whitfield entered. His presence cracked the air sharper than any shout. He carried a folder in one hand, papers already creased by fury. Behind him, lawyers filed in like shadows, their eyes narrowed into lines that measured risk. "Control the story," one muttered. "Stabilize the market." But Malik's eyes were not on the papers, nor the lawyers. They were on Amara. She had not flinched when her father entered. She had not moved at all. Only her fingers twitched, as though fighting the urge to reach outward. Richard circled the room, voice calm enough to frighten. He spoke of reputation, of empire, of the danger of mixing gold with garbage. Every sentence dripped with disdain, but beneath it lay fear, the fear of losing the silence that had built his throne. Amara's head turned slowly, her eyes locking on Malik. She did not speak, not yet, but the meaning in her stare was undeniable. "Will you stand, or will you vanish?" Malik's throat burned. The lawyers were circling, pens ready, contracts thick with clauses meant to erase him. His name had been nothing for so long, now they wanted it gone again, but on their terms. How many of us have watched truth get buried under paperwork? If you've seen power silence someone before, subscribe now. Because silence signed is silence surrendered. The confrontation escalated. Richard gestured toward Malik, listing his insignificance like charges in a courtroom: no pedigree, no wealth, no value. A man whose life had been measured in bins and shifts, not titles. But Malik didn't break. He let the accusations fall, one after another, until the air was thick with contempt. Then he did the unthinkable, he looked directly at Amara and nodded once. It was a gesture small enough to escape the lawyers, but not her. For the first time in weeks, her lips parted. Her voice, unused but unbroken, threaded through the atrium. "He matters." 2 words. The marble seemed to echo them longer than the sound itself lasted. The lawyers froze mid-pen. Richard's eyes flared with rage he couldn't disguise. The silence that followed was not empty, it was charged, alive, dangerous. Would you have risked everything to say those 2 words? If you wouldn't, ask yourself why. Subscribe now, because courage unspoken is courage wasted. The meeting fractured after that. Richard slammed the folder shut, orders barked to the lawyers, threats muttered like incantations. Malik was dismissed with the force of expulsion, shoved back toward the gates by shadows in coats. But in those last seconds, Amara acted. As he turned, she rose and stepped forward. A guard moved to block her, but she lifted her hand, firm and final. Her father's fury filled the air, but she ignored it. She closed the distance to Malik and placed her palm against his sleeve. No words, no spectacle, just touch. The moment seared itself into Malik's skin. No camera caught it, no crowd cheered it. It was private, and therefore more dangerous than anything public. When the guards dragged him out into the night, Malik did not resist. The gates shut with the weight of history. But the warmth of her hand lingered, and with it, a truth. Her voice had not freed her yet, but her choice had. That night, Malik didn't sleep. He sat in his dim apartment, the restraining order still pinned to his table, and thought of 2 words: he matters. And for the first time in his life, he believed it. The city woke to cardboard signs and cold breath. Sidewalks filled before sunrise, workers in neon vests, nurses in scrubs, school custodians still smelling of bleach, delivery riders with gloves cut at the fingers. Someone painted words across the pavement outside the Whitfield estate in chalk that looked like frost from a distance: names matter. Hands matter. A drumline began with nothing more than 2 sticks on a barricade. The beat was simple and stubborn. Inside, the house tried to pretend mornings were always like this. Silver trays. Folded linens. Footsteps that learned to whisper years ago. But nothing held the shape it had yesterday. Security briefings stretched into new pages. Lawyers layered new clauses over old ones. A florist replaced lilies that had fainted overnight. The scent of their replacement sweetened the halls and turned the air cloying. Amara watched from a window that had never been asked to learn humility. The glass showed her a corridor version of herself, pale dress, thin wrists, the faint outline where a hospital bracelet had tugged at skin. Beyond the reflection, the city gathered. Not for a gala. For her. For the thing she had made real when she chose sound. Her father rehearsed calm in the room behind her. An aide listed scenarios, each one prefaced with a cost. "We can move her to the mountain property," someone said. "We can secure a medical injunction," said another. "We can reset the narrative." The word landed like a lie that had forgotten how to blush. Reset to what? To the silence that bought comfort. To the safety bought with not looking. In the service wing, a housekeeper named Edna tucked a paper into her apron and carried a tray toward the family rooms. She had been here long enough to know how to blend into the wallpaper. She had survived decades by being furniture with a heartbeat. Today, the heartbeat wanted to be loud. The paper in her apron crackled like a conscience. She had copied a phone number from a flyer on the gate. Below the digits she'd written 2 words in careful print: "We see you." At the depot, Malik signed out a truck older than his good knee. The supervisor held his gaze an extra second, a mercy disguised as bureaucracy. "Stay off the estate street," the man said softly. "Routes are fluid today." It was advice and a warning and a prayer. The radio in the truck fought static. Every station had an opinion. Some voices praised, some scolded, some tried on neutrality like a new suit. Malik turned the volume down so low it sounded like insects. He needed the road, not the noise. He did not plan to drive past the estate. Asphalt and gravity planned it for him. By mid-morning the block was a river that refused to stay in the gutter. Signs rose like oars. "Do better. See us. We work. You look." Someone held a cardboard cut out of a microphone with the words "Let her speak" scrawled in marker you could smell from the curb. The first sirens arrived, the blue and white kind that try to be reasonable. Officers set lines, posted their palms flat, used the tone they practice in mirrors. The crowd obeyed, mostly, the way a tide obeys when the moon is kind. A side gate opened for a car that had a right to be obeyed. The crowd snarled and then swallowed itself. A tinted window slid down just enough for a lens to taste the air. Reporters shouted questions calibrated to sound like care. The car continued, the window closed, the air remembered the shape of the gap and forgot it. Inside, a decision swelled without permission. Amara had slept little and dreamed less. When she closed her eyes, she saw the square again, her palm, his palm, glass refusing the hunger of skin. When she opened them, she saw the same thing. There are images that lodge in a person the way seeds are put into dirt. They demand weather. They ignore schedules. Her aunt entered with a folder like a blade. "Sign this and we can heal," she said, voice smooth from years of not having to raise it. Heal meant hide. Heal meant make the public comfortable. Heal meant let the story rejoin its leash. Amara did not reach for the pen. She reached for the memory that wasn't memory anymore. The path her hand had made in air. The answer it had found through glass. Outside, the chant braided itself into something old and new at once. Not a song. A declaration. The sound you get when people in different languages decide to mean one thing together. The beat moved through metal and into bone. It found the dining room chairs and made them hum. In a conference room with a view so large it turned the city into a screensaver, Richard spread a map of exits. North stairwell to garage. Vehicle 3. Tunnel to East Gate. He traced lines with a cufflink that cost more than a truck. We move in 10. A lawyer cleared a throat made of paper. There's a risk if she appears compliant. We need control, Richard said, and the word revealed the thing it always reveals when it forgets to wear perfume. Edna stepped into the doorway with a tray that steamed. "Tea," she said, as if tea could be armor. No one looked at the tray. She set it down. Her hands shook, but only enough for the saucers to announce themselves. As she turned to go, the paper in her apron slipped, then paused against the fabric's friction, then fell just shy of the threshold. Amara bent without thinking, fingers closing on the paper. The digits and the message sat in her palm like a small, hot coin. "We see you." The choice came without thunder. It did not sound like destiny. It sounded like breath. She stood. "Sit," her father said, but the word was a habit, not a power. She crossed the room like a person who has learned how polished floors conspire to keep you cautious and decided to be clumsy anyway. At the inner door a guard shifted to block. She did not glare him down. She looked past him, through him, the way people look at whether they are done negotiating with. The door opened because hands opened it. Not hers. Edna's. "Stairs are clear," the housekeeper said to no one, everyone, history. They moved. Not with the stealth movies ask for. With the steadiness of people who accept that noise will come and do not plan to apologize for it. The guard looked at his partner and found no instruction except the one his chest had learned when it decided to be human. He did not reach. He did not report. He let the air keep its shape. 3 flights. One locked door that yielded to a key that had learned to believe in emergencies. A corridor where the paint smelled new and the cameras were not yet wired. A service exit to a courtyard that had never imagined it would have to tell a story this big. Outside, the crowd stiffened. The first person to see them was not a reporter. It was a janitor on his lunch break, his sandwich still in the brown paper. He lifted it like a salute, then lowered it because hands are better used for other things. He did not shout. He didn't need to. Eyes learn faster than mouths. The noise rose without turning ugly. It rose the way water rises when a dam remembers what it used to be. Signs tipped toward the stairs. Bodies rearranged to make a channel. Officers glanced at supervisors and found no orders that fit this shape. A camera on a boom arced like an animal craning to smell. From the curb, Malik saw the movement before he understood it. He had parked legally, halfway down the block at a hydrant whose paint had peeled into continents. He stood with the hood up on the truck he'd been assigned because the fan belt screamed when pride was at stake. The scream faded under the crowd's change in pitch. He lowered the hood and wiped his hands on a rag that had given up its right to be clean. He did not expect relief. He expected a trick. The world had taught him that surprise married to money produces cruelty 9 times out of 10. Then he saw her. No stage. No lectern. No microphone dressed up like a promise. Just stairs and a crowd and a woman and the weather. She moved like someone stepping from a picture frame. Not a rescue. Not a chase. A leaving. Edna at her shoulder, chin up, jaw set, a guard 2 paces behind, eyes on the crowd, hand nowhere near his radio. The chant fell apart and reassembled itself around the absence of fear. Malik didn't rush. He didn't raise his arms. He let the moment show him what speed it needed. He stepped forward 1 line, then another, until the crowd's heat reached his face. The drum on the barricade found his ribs and borrowed them. Amara reached the bottom step and paused the way a person pauses before touching water. The air between them seemed thinner than air knows how to be. 100 phones rose, cautious and hungry and ashamed. Somewhere a television anchor found a tone that let her sound like a person for 3 seconds. Edna slid left, making room without leaving. The guard held his place like a book left open at a page someone intends to return to. Richard appeared at the top of the stairs with a roar he had trained for rooms where sound is supposed to stay. The roar dissolved in open air. Power hates sky. Amara's eyes found Malik. They did not ask for permission. They offered it. He nodded, once, small. Not consent granted, not orders obeyed. Recognition. They closed the last distance like people learning how to breathe together. No embrace. No spectacle. She reached, and this time skin met skin without glass translating. Her hand found his forearm where the rag hadn't gotten all the grit. His other hand hovered, then settled above her knuckles like a roof that doesn't leak. The crowd did a sound that wasn't cheer, wasn't sob, wasn't anything a stadium knows how to make. It was relief's cousin. It was the opposite of pity. On the steps above, Richard moved. Security tensed, then hesitated, then chose the more difficult profession. They became a boundary that protected rather than a wall that imprisoned. A police captain waded through bodies to reach the bottom stair, breath fogging, palms open. "We need a lane," he shouted, and the crowd did something crowds rarely do because they want to be worthy of the story they're inside. They made one. A path opened through people with signs and people with jobs to get back to and people who would tell their grandkids they learned how to move their feet that day. Amara didn't look back. Malik didn't look up. They stepped into the channel that had no choreography and every intention. It led not to the cars her family had armored, not to the doors that had learned to open for only some, but toward the street where the truck's paint remembered better years. They didn't hurry. Speed belongs to panic. This belonged to choice. A camera on a rooftop caught the geometry, the richest house on the block exhaling a figure into a crowd that refused to be called a mob, and a man from the side of the road becoming center without asking. The shot traveled faster than light's reputation says it can. Screens in barbershops, break rooms, hospital waiting areas, security booths, kitchens over laundromats, everywhere the city hides its labor, tilted forward. Near the curb, a uniformed officer lifted the yellow tape and blinked hard against wind. Malik held it for Amara as she ducked, then ducked himself, the way you do when your grandmother taught you manners you thought the world would never require of you again. "Don't run," someone said behind them, but no one was running. They reached the truck. Its side panel bore dents the city had given it. The door handle stuck for a second, then decided to be on their side. Malik offered the step with his palm. Amara didn't climb. She didn't get into the truck exactly. She put one foot on the step and turned back to the crowd, the estate, the windows that pretended they weren't eyes. She lifted her chin. Her mouth opened, not for a speech, not for a lesson, not for anything that would let anyone write a neat headline. A single word left her, not aimed at marble or money or men who thought contracts could leash weather. Walking. It wasn't grand. It was a map. She stepped down from the truck and into the lane that had been kept for her. Malik matched her stride a half pace behind and to the left, where support lives when it isn't trying to own. Edna fell in on the other side, apron wrinkled, hairnet stubborn. The guard walked 3 paces back, deciding to keep his job by changing what his job meant. They moved. Not toward cameras. Through them. Not toward safety. Through the risk. Not toward a resolution drafted by a board. Through the crowd that had made itself an answer. Signs bobbed. Boots scuffed. A child on a father's shoulders whispered, loud enough to be heard by the only person who needed to hear it, "She's not alone." The father nodded like prayer you do with your neck because your mouth forgot the words. On the stairs, Richard shouted a name that had never refused to come when called. It didn't come. He tried again, and the shape of the sound collapsed. Above the street, windows opened that had been engineered to stay shut. Faces leaned out. Someone threw confetti that had been meant for a parade next spring. It looked beautiful for a moment and then looked like litter, which is what beauty often becomes when it doesn't find work. A teenager with a dustpan grinned and let it fall anyway. Some messes deserve to exist. They passed the corner where the chalk had read "Names Matter." Feet had smudged the letters. New chalk restored them, thicker. The drum on the barricade changed rhythm to match the direction of bodies. For a second the whole block felt like a single organism that had remembered it wasn't designed to serve money. If this makes your chest lift, don't look away, subscribe. At the next intersection, traffic surrendered. A bus driver with a schedule and a mortgage lifted a hand from the wheel and saluted with 2 fingers. A cyclist clicked out of his pedals and leaned his head on the handlebar, letting his throat work. They did not announce where they were going. Announcements are for people who fear being misunderstood. They walked. Past the place where gardeners had trained hedges to behave. Past a bronze statue of a man on a horse whose plaque had learned to lie. Past a newsstand where the morning editions already looked old. News helicopters found them and tried to turn the street into a diagram. The wind from the rotors pushed hair the wrong way and tugged at cardboard. The crowd leaned as one, and the air forgave the machines for not knowing how to be quiet. At a hydrant painted red through 3 layers of municipal budget, a child offered Amara a plastic daisy with a stem too green to have come from anywhere but a toy aisle. The heiress who had never been allowed to hold her own story took it like a relic and slid it through the laces on her wrist where a bracelet had once bitten. The crowd didn't cheer. It inhaled as if lungs have opinions. You said you'd care about stories like this, prove it. Subscribe. Blocks later, the estate was small behind them. It sat in the distance the way old mistakes sit, visible, undeniable, incapable of deciding the next step. The lane the crowd had made began to dissolve into ordinary sidewalk. Life threatened to reassert itself, deli bells, crosswalk beeps, the song of a car whose owner had learned indifference. The march became walking. The walking became something even simpler, people going somewhere without asking a gate's permission. A sedan drifted too close. A hand rose, not Malik's, not Amara's. A stranger's, flat, gentle, absolute. The driver exhaled and waited. Waiting learned usefulness. At the edge of Midtown, a low church with a door that stuck cracked open as if it had a nose and smelled what was happening. An usher no one had sent propped it wider with a hymn book. The sanctuary beyond was dim, warm, unshiny. They did not turn toward it. Not yet. Not because faith repelled. Because walking was the faith today. 3 cameramen peeled off, batteries dying. 2 influencers realized they could not monetize this kind of quiet. A columnist closed his notebook and looked guilty for having enjoyed the idea of crafting a clever line. If you've demanded a show from someone fighting to breathe, change that now, subscribe. The sky smudged into afternoon. The cold learned manners. The city did not become kind. It became possible. They reached a cross street where a banner hung from scaffolding, Job Fair, Wednesday. A cluster of workers in hard hats leaned on a railing and watched with expressions that said the world had surprised them and they had decided to forgive it for once. One lifted his chin at Malik, the smallest kinship, the kind that builds bridges no engineer could design. Malik returned it, the nod traveling through years that had refused to let him be seen. Amara stopped beneath the banner and looked up. She didn't read it out loud. She didn't need to. She lowered her gaze to the crowd and found faces, not categories, not demographics. Faces. She folded the plastic daisy tighter into its improvised bracelet. Richard arrived at the corner in a car that thought speed was a language. It wasn't. He stepped out with words that had always worked. They didn't now. The crowd did not boo. It did something worse for a man who only understood transaction, it ignored him. He tried to catch Amara's eye with the net of a father's history. She let it pass. The police captain from the morning reappeared on foot, cap under his arm, lines deeper from work that is mostly listening. Keep the lane, he called, and officers did, this time with faces that didn't look bored to be decent. Amara looked at Malik. He didn't need her eyes to tell him what was next. He felt it in the rhythm of boots around them, in the way the block leaned forward, in the permission the city had just offered like a hand you take because it would be rude not to. They turned toward the avenue. They kept walking. Not into a sunset. Into weather, and rent, and hearings, and headlines, and the bright, ordinary terror of tomorrow. The kind of ending that refuses to be an ending because endings are for people who can afford to stop. If this felt like standing up, don't sit down, subscribe.